Hi, everyone. Happy Monday. So let's discuss the status we have right now. I think we ended up with the decouple pod group API as the main cap for the workload API. Is that right? We are not going to update anything else in the gang scheduling cap.
There is the sorry, go ahead, Mateusz.
So like we have two, right? Well, one is the one you own. It's the new cap or decoupled pod group. And we are also updating the gang scheduling cap to basically say, like mention your cap that we have now decoupled model and update to basically make sure it also reflects the current state. And we had a meeting with team today, and like finally the decision has been made. So we are staying in alpha. There will be alpha 2 as we discussed last week. Like that's a decision to operate under that assumption to make sure we have everything ready and submitted on time. So we are staying in alpha 2, and we'll have new alpha 2 API, but we are staying in alpha with the only new decoupled mode supported. So we are not supporting any hybrid approaches, like the old thing where workload had the pod groups inside won't be supported in 136. So I think that should make it easier for like integrators and also for scheduler, because we only need to support one mode, and there will be like one code path going forward. So that's the decision we have. Now we need to make sure we submit those three actually PRs, because there is also the job integration PR before the freeze. So yeah, that should be the focus for the next 2 days. And team already started looking at our PR, so hopefully he will help us like get the final answers to the API questions we have, right? For example, like I think the only remaining one is actually the naming convention in the pod API for referencing the pod group, right? So yeah, we are waiting for the feedback from him.
Yeah. So what I've tried to do to make the decoupled pod API as ready as we can is to assume that we are going, like with the decision that we already had, and that like lots of reflect this actually in the cap. Please make sure please help me that like to make sure that like I already reflect everything. Couple of things that still not clear. I believe we will not have answer until you have a meeting with them today. One is the naming convention. The second one is basically the reference for the workload and the pod group template inside pod group API. So how to make like how to make the reference? Is it like one reference and like have the workload name plus the like how the reference will like will look like?
I think I think that those are actually like because we have two references. Like one, we have reference from the pod inside the pod, whatever we decide, and that is something that we are waiting for teams like feedback about the options there. But I think that decision was like it's not necessarily the same decision as we have like from pod group to workload, because I think that what you currently have in the cap, what we either discussed or like discussed in the comments, like I can't remember like when exactly it appeared, where we effectively reference the specific place in the workload to reference the pod template. I think that's actually fine. I like this pattern. So, and I think we should like maybe we'll get some feedback like in the meantime too. And I'm like we should definitely discuss if someone has concerns about it. But I would assume that for now, unless someone like objects, I would assume that this is actually okay. I added a bunch of like other comments to to that cap like earlier today. Neither of them are like fundamental. I think most of them are like quite like targeted and local. I think we have much more like things to resolve in the job cap because
exactly. This is what I'm working on right now. I supposed to work during the weekend, but it is what it is. I couldn't make it. So hopefully by the end of today, I will have the job integration cap ready for another round of review, and I will address all the feedback from everyone. Okay,
I think,
perfect.
sorry, one quick comment. I think that if you can prioritize the pod group, like the remaining comments, I think, because if we have like job ready and pod group not ready, then we are like messed
both
up.
of them,
Anyway.
both of them would be ready today. Okay,
perfect.
by the end of.
And I think if there is a chance that like you will not manage to do something, like the pod group is more important.
No, both of them would be ready by the end of today. I didn't mention the pod group API because I felt like it's, like the work there is not significant.
It should be relatively small,
yeah. So, but both of them would be ready for the team, your team, to review you tomorrow morning. Matt?
I just wanted to say that for what it's worth, we already had a very similar situation with the reference in 135, where pod references pod group inside the workload. Right? We went with this workload, like struct workload reference with name of the workload and name of the template, or the pod group. And this is a parallel to what we have now, the pod group referencing the pod group template. So I believe like that's +1 for what we already have now in the KEP, because I believe the API review for similar pattern was already made, and I think it's very likely that we'll also get the approval here. So
and also for what it's worth, like when we were discussing had some first round of discussions with Tim about like what to do in the pod now, like he explicitly mentioned that like the original reference where we are actually referencing like a place in the workload, which is exactly what we are doing in the pod group now, actually made sense to him. And it's a different, like it's more or less what I said also. Like it's a different kind of reference than from pod to pod group. So
one comment actually it was from Kevin or Andrea about the reference. So they asked when we have like group of group or like a gang bot group of bot group, are we going to reference the sub bot group in this reference as well? It's going like longer. I think this is their point, and I believe we don't need to, but let's let's have discussions of this after. But for now, what should we address?
So I think that there are effectively we didn't yet figure out like what's the right design for the subgroups, because I think that the primary two options that we have is like either we will have like a dedicated top level object for like pod group and then pod subgroup and then maybe pod set or whatever, like, and then we will get like the pod should effectively be pointing to the leaf of that tree. So what we will like evolve towards is will be like one of like in the pod group reference there will be one of to point to one of those, which we can do like in backward compatible way. But the other option is that we will effectively end up with a single pod group type, and it then will be able to we will be able to make it like of a different type. So like it will be pod group of type pod group or pod group of type pod subgroup, whatever, like then it will be pointing to pod group. So like I think that's like in as described in the document that we had with Matt, like I think like in all those cases we believe we can do that in backward compatible way. Maybe it's not like the nicest way to do it, but like effectively we need a way to like if we will end up with multiple different objects, we need a way to point to each of those. So like I think that this additional field or fields like will be like necessary. So
I just wanted to add, this is also something Tim is looking at, because like while we believe we can make the change in 137 and it will be backward compatible, unfortunately it will impact the naming convention. Like it impacts the naming convention that we need now, right? For example, for like pod subgroup reference, whatever, pod group reference. Like just to make sure that there is a way going forward. So Tim is like thinking about this. He wrote me on chat. And yeah, but like I think it's obvious to everyone that or we agree that pod should reference like the immediate execution context, right? Which might be a subgroup in the future. So yeah. But the question is about like so we know we can do that, but the question is like how to come up with a right naming convention now, so we will have like both options available in 137.
Okay, Andrea?
Yeah, I think I just have one quick question for this hierarchy, right? I think we have like a small discussion with Edwin on the proposal for decoupling pod groups, right? I think for accelerating workload API to beta. So it looks like team is having discussion with you guys, right, on whether we want to introduce hierarchy in the future, right? Because I guess right now it's unclear whether we need it.
So like what team is reviewing is the like API, right? And he's not discussing with us whether we should have hierarchy or not. I think that's our decision as like the workload our scheduling working group here, like an informal. But like team is helping us with design of the API, so we will have like options available in the future, right? So
yeah, because I think like, hierarchy, we might need to have kind of more deep discussion after we have this, Alpha 2 API, because I think
agree.
right now it's really unclear, like what is the level of hierarchy we want to introduce, right?
I think
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think that like for me, it's pretty clear we will need a hierarchy, but like we definitely are very far from a decision like how exactly it should look like, and like so yes, I think that's not definitely something for now. Like once we have everything for the freeze for this cycle, like we can start discussing that. But
Okay. Yeah, because one of the point I was making in the doc that's maybe we should end up with, grouping, multiple pod groups to the single, entity. I think it's especially might be useful when you might have a different resource claims of different groups, but you want to group them in a single gang, right? If you think about more kind of, disaggregated inference use cases, right? But yeah, I understand that might become more complex when how you're going to manage the state, etc., right, between multiple groups of the pod groups, right? So anyway, I mean, hopefully, yeah, go good.
I think that like for me, conceptually, this is exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you have like multiple pod groups that form like a single entity versus like you have multiple new things that form one pod group.
Yeah.
Like you effectively achieve the same. So like for me, conceptually, it's simpler to add like a layer below because we now have like we already made scheduler to think in terms of like pod groups. Like it treats like pod group as a scheduling unit. So adding like a layer below that and make pod group like effectively this grouping entity that you just mentioned will be like a smaller redesign on the scheduler side than like adding one on top. And like the end effect for me, like I'm happy to be challenged, but like for me it's like conceptually the same.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think also the tricky part will be if you decide to group multiple pod groups, how we're going to manage the state, for example, right?
Yeah.
Because then also be super very complex, right, for us to do so. But anyway, we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's like we are definitely not yet fully ready for like super detailed discussion. I think it's like still a little bit like early in the thinking process. So
okay. Another decision that I wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page. We're in the job integration. So the way that I'm assuming now to opt out from creating the workload and bot group API and bot group, yes, is to have the owner reference uh, for like higher controller. So for example, the job set, if the job set controller created already their workflow for the workload, they will create the workload and they will have in the job owner, like the owner reference for their controller, and then the controller job, the job controller will see that, and it will decide, okay, I'm opting out. I'm not creating a workload for this because someone else is creating it. Is this are we okay with that for the opt out?
So what I was suggesting is not relying on owner reference in particular for that, but rather on the like controller ref field in the workload itself. It's like conceptually it's like similar thing, but we already have like a targeted field for that in the workload, so we can use it.
Oh, targeted field, do you mean like a new field in the job API?
No, it already is in workload.
In the pod template, right? You mean in
the workload object.
In the workload object. Okay, if we have a workload, so you wanted to get this target from the workload. So if we have a workload object, we need to go and check the target ref, or like the object for this workload. Okay.
So you need to what you effectively, the question that you need to be able to answer is there any workload for this particular job, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I'm assuming that we will need some index, like in memory index in job controller anyway, that will be keeping this like relation from workload to job and vice versa, like probably both ways. And like we can build that based on those reference or this like controller ref or however that like field is called in the workload API.
Okay, so the two places that we can know this relationship, one is the owner ref. The second one is inside the job, the pod template. Inside the pod template, there is a workload ref. Okay.
So I'm assuming that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm assuming that the relation is actually the other way. So like it's not that job is pointing to anything. It's just like workload is pointing to job.
But what Heba was saying, and that was also Eric's question. Eric's comment on the PR, that right now there is inside the pod there is a workload reference pointing to workload. And we had this other discussion and we discussed like what should be the behavior of the controller. We decided that if you leave it empty, you basically leave it up to controller to manage, right? Create workloads, etc. But like another option of using this field is basically to like set something there, which tells the controller, I don't want to use like your workload management logic, whatever, right? So this might be also a way to opt out. But that being said, this is pending the decision that Till will make, like what are we doing with this reference and whether we are keeping workload or not. Like because it's also possible that we'll say we'll add workload reference later and we'll only reference to pod group because this is the immediate execution context. This is actually needed, right, for scheduler to work. We have different purpose for the workload reference right now, which is more like observability, debugability. So yeah.
I just feel like we might end up with the issues with this approach because the higher level control, job set, train job, we do not really guarantee the order of creation of resources, which means like, won't we end up with a situation when job set creates job first and the workload second, which means when the job will be created, the job controller will try to create the workload as well. So the problem with this approach, we might end up with the ordering is not guaranteed, right? Do you see any issues with that?
In this case, like job set, like in general, controllers should not do anything or like should ensure that the workload is created before like doing any other actions. Same for pod group, basically.
Yeah, but how without on the reference on the job API, you will make a decision whether you want or don't want to create a workload in a job controller?
Based on, I'm looking like I have an index. We need to maintain an index from like, we need to be able, like it's effectively, we need to be able to make to answer a question if for a given job we already have a workload or not, right?
Yeah, but like you cannot make a decision because because the order is not guaranteed, right? Like, jobs that just run, can create jobs first, maybe workload first, second, right? We cannot really understand, yeah, good.
So Wojtek is saying that we'll always create workload first, but I think your point is still valid because then like the information about the workload existent needs to propagate to job
for example,
raise possible like
for example, like in train job API, right? We do create config maps, we do create secrets, we also create job sets, and then we might also want to create a workload API. So I cannot give you the guarantee of the ordering when you hit the job controller because job set will create the jobs that the workload is being already created. Which means like from my perspective, checking on the reference is maybe a better approach because we always say the higher level controller must create the workload API, right? unless I'm missing something here, like how you want to detect this.
Overall, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? We have this circle here. Ideally, we would have an API, right, on the controller side, where we could express things like opt out or maybe opt in, like that's to be decided, right? But we don't have that one yet, so we are trying to avoid that by like
So
because once we introduce API, it's an API, and we need to follow with this path. So that's the problem that we have here, right? But I hope we can make like just simple use case for job to work, just to prove the integration with the new decoupled pod group and the workload API, and like we will need to solve all those problems in 137. So we'll need discussions like yeah.
But to Andre, your assumption is right. The higher controller always, like we expect the higher controller to create the workload and pod group. So hopefully, as Kevin is, like is mentioned or mentioned in the chat right now, you can just, like hold the reconciliation until the workload and pod group is already created for the job set, for example, and then you can continue reconciliation.
Yeah. Like my idea wasn't getting like blame me for other ideas, but like if you have on the reference on a job, we won't create the workload. It's the simplest opt-out thing we can do. Like I don't know, do we have any concerns with that? I guess like you have other opinion, right, on opt-out initially.
No, I think that like we can I think that makes sense, like especially for alpha. I think that like we can discuss like later, but I think like for alpha I can imagine multiple different criteria for like opting out, like and like having owner reference for like on the job itself. I think that sounds reasonable, at least as one of those.
Okay.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is at least for jobs, like what Eric I think was suggesting would probably work pretty well there, where we could just set the workload reference in the pod template of the job anyway, and then that can probably short circuit the job controller creating these things too. So I don't even know if we need the owner reference in that case, because like we would be populating the job template with whatever the workload name and pod groups are. So that should effectively disable the job from doing that.
Like it's an option, assuming we will go with workload reference having the workload reference inside pod, because this API is now being discussed with Tim Hawking. So,
but I think it's a valid it's a valid way, because the job set has to it's part of creating the object anyway to add any specifications for your pod template. So if you add in the pod template for this job set, that like you have a workload reference, now you're just opt out. So the job set can start with that. So when we go to the job controller, we already have this reference, so we will just.
So what Matt is like saying is that we effectively don't know yet if we will have workload reference in the pod. Like,
yes,
because like there is a chance, like one of the options that like is being considered is that like we will only have a pod group reference, because that's all that scheduler needs for now. And the workload, like the pointer to the workload object itself is more like debuggability / like usability and so on. So it's also so depending like what like team will decide to be the cleanest and like smartest. And like that option with like setting it in the pod template may or may not be feasible, right? Because we may
that's what I'm trying to say. And just to make it clear, like there are problems with having both right now, right? Because without having a full story behind it, because having both now opens us to problems like we have a pod pointing to workload A and pointing through pod group that points to workload B, right? That's illegal situation. Like what to do with that, right? So that's why maybe an option is to go without workload reference now, which simplifies this, like removes this problem. and then in 137 added again with a full like separate KEP user story, like we want to improve debuggability, whatever, and these problems of like inconsistent state will solve via validation, whatever. So that's the discussions we are having right now.
Yeah, we still can reach to the workload through, or like via the pod group. It will be just another jump. So it is still visible, but it will cost us a little bit more. Dominic?
Yeah, but I think it's completely unclear whether pod group needs to point to workload itself as well. This is the same problem. But I just wanted to say that team responded to the comments in the KEP. So if you want, you can look into them, but they actually are not super clarifying things. So if you expected to have a straight answer, then it's probably not.
Okay.
But basically, not having workload reference at all, I think it's safer for now. If we have a structure of pod groups, then which of the pod groups should reference to workload? The top level one or all of them?
Okay. I think we need to...
Actually, sorry, just one small comment. I think you're right. Like what you can in terms of, we don't really need on the reference if we, as Kevin said, if we set if we decide to go with the pod group ref, we don't need to check down the reference, right? Like the opt-out can be the job control, just check if this API is set on the pod template, right? And then it won't add, something on top, right? So we just can also opt out from the getting scheduling on the job site, checking the pod template spec, right? I think this was one of the also like requirements, right? There. So I guess like we need to understand like whether pod template will have the pod group ref, right? Pod group template ref eventually, right? And then decide how we can opt out from this feature. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Perfect. Another, I think, so this still, like not clear. Maybe by then, okay, maybe in sig-scheduling meeting, your tomorrow morning, we can have more clarification, or like we know what is the final decision, so we can address these in the KEP, hopefully. Okay, so moving to the DRA integration, Matt, sorry, Matt.
Oh no, I think that was like easy enough.
Yeah, so the DRA integration, John and John, do you have anything to share?
I don't think so. I've been trying to keep up with feedback best I can. And I know the API examples and stuff might be slightly out of date depending on how the pod group stuff shakes out, but I'm trying to stay relatively current with that stuff.
Has Jordan looked at it yet?
I have not seen any signs that he's looked at it, no.
Then I'll talk to him. And I think he was asking about it. I think it was last week, and it was like still in revision, and I told him that to hold off. So I think because he's only available Tuesday through Thursday, so that's why we get a little bit less. Nothing on Monday and Friday. Okay, so I'll yeah, I think we're as far as I know, I'll take another run through it, but
I just went through it like earlier today too, and like it looks like modular, like what you mentioned, like maybe like syncing up, and like I had one minor other comment, but other than that, it looked great to me. So
okay, awesome. Thanks.
Anything related to the KEPs? Any questions so far from anyone else? Okay, so I have a quick question. I already, like had this discussion, but it was individual in the DMs. There is a suggestion to have the workload for WAS and FAS as a working group, a dedicated working group. Do you think this is the good way, or like the right approach, or do you think this meeting, like the weekly meeting, for a couple of like other weeks until we we get, like done with the workload API would be sufficient, and that's it. And we can continue in sig-scheduling. What do you think? Kevin?
It probably, I mean, I guess it depends how long do we see this work ongoing. There is, I think I'm on the working group batch side, so I feel like there's a lot of strong overlap with Q and WAS. We also could probably consider like a dedicated, like, I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't have like a work stream for working group batch for WAS, but I guess the other things, if Slack channels or email threads could be useful. And of course, I'm speaking for the other chairs here, but I don't know. It's, I guess, like one option I can talk with Yuki and Marcin about, like working group batch. There's like a work stream for WAS for now. So, but we also could do, if someone wants to go through the process of creating a working group, I think it's actually probably useful in itself. But I will let John speak.
Yeah, I mean, we talked before about trying to do it through, like at the summit, about trying to do it through working group device management. I don't think that's really working very well. So the thing is, like, right, you have the auto scaling stuff, and I know that that's going to be the next phase of this, which may not even be relevant for batch. That's probably more relevant for inference type workloads, right? Like, so auto scaling, scheduling, and apps seem to me like the three SIGs that are mostly involved. So, but there's overhead with it. So it's a kind of like, I don't know. I found it really useful. We had the same kind of like ambivalence about whether we should start working group device management, and I felt like it's been a useful forum for making progress. So in that sense, I'm sort of like, makes sense to go ahead with it, but it's, I'm not going to be the one dealing with the overhead. It's easier for me to say that because I wouldn't be chairing it or anything.
Yeah. So I believe that my thoughts here is WAS and PAS, we can combine them together in one working group. So we are not doing this again for the PAS, but I can see now it's like involving, as you mentioned, the apps and scheduling a little bit. It will be the auto scaling, and I can see you and the sub projects. They will need a lot of support to get it integrated correctly, and like have the right time to design this integration. The DRA, it's another thing. So I can see the WAS, it's like like a common topic now between lots of sub projects, lots of SIGs. It might get like involved in other SIGs in the future as well. It's an overhead, but if this will make things clear for the community, so it's just one place to go and know what's going on in this, like in this work stream right now. What is the plan? What is the future plan? What is the backlog? I think it might make sense. Kevin and Matt.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I've already been asked from a few people about like the the notes for this call and other things, and I'm kind of saying it's spread everywhere, and I try to keep that one up. But I mean, again, I guess I'm kind of with John. Like, I'm probably will not be the one doing it, so I'll leave it up to you all about the charter and everything. But I think it's probably better because I see this ongoing for a pretty long time, and it might be worth getting these things organized now.
Matt?
So it seems I will be the devil's advocate here, but I agree with part of what John said and Kevin. Like, I wouldn't underestimate the overhead here, right? Because it's pretty high overhead. Like, it's a big cost to create and maintain a working group. So personally, I would like consider more informal ways of working until we see real problems where actually working group would help. So definitely like improving our communication channels, having some official Slack channel, etc. Right? That those are like good first step, but I would be careful with starting.
Sorry, there is one benefit, Matt, though, of like you get a dedicated slot at KubeCon.
Okay, like do we need it now? Maybe
is that worth it? I don't know, right? But the I mean, the overhead's not. I mean, it's a meeting, right, every 2 weeks, and it's not that bad, honestly. It really isn't as much overhead as it sounds like. So, I mean, again, I'm not the one doing it, so for you guys, so it's easy for me to say. But you got to write a charter, and then you got to like hold the meetings, and you got to, But we're doing the meetings anyway. So if we're going to keep doing the meetings anyway, then it's almost like, what's the difference?
I think
some people who like started the patch working group that actually the cost was high, like to start everything, and so that's why I have like mixed feelings here. But
I think the decision should not the decision, but like I'd like to hear like from the sig scheduling and sig apps if this is like really needed.
And I'm not saying we should like never do that. I'm just saying like
But I think we're hunting sig scheduling right now. It's like they cannot do anything because of the WAS work, and I feel so bad for this. The whole meeting is just about WAS, so I think they need to please, Dominic.
Yeah, so my opinion is exactly like the ones that were already shared. For me, it's clear that we have internally WAS integration working group. And I think this is something that we should continue. We could continue it as a part of the sig scheduling separate dedicated meeting. So instead of defining formal working group, we simply run it internally. I like also the focus that people have. So that this is not something that like sig scheduling has to lead those meetings. I think it's okay for you to continue leading this meeting and simply make the purpose of that exactly the same, whether we have the working group or not.
It might be a little bit more organized, like having a dedicated label, for example, so people can track everything related to it. Slack channel, that's it. But to be honest, I can see the pain in the community. Lots of people actually started to, like send me a DMs, like what is going on in the WAS right now? Like how can I track this? What is the future plan?
Yeah. So I think that as also you said, the integration will change toward like integration with cluster with auto scaling, with queue. Those will be completely different topics, but probably anything, most of the KEPs that will be here will be under sig scheduling anyway. So sig scheduling will have to be involved deeply in that. So having a dedicated WAS meeting, 100% sure that this is worth having. Only one sig meeting every 2 weeks is not sufficient.
But so we do have like this meeting, right? So like it will just become official one. I see. Okay.
We could put into it sig scheduling agenda under, once a week we have sig scheduling, second week we have WAS. We can, of course, sometimes mix those topics, but everything should be in one document, agenda and comments. That would be helpful to keep track on what's going on. Typically, we don't have that many sig scheduling specific items. There are, of course, but our main goal is to have this workload awareness as a part of scheduling. So it goes beyond scheduling, but the core part is about being able to schedule we will have topics like how to make the scheduling more efficient, what kind of algorithms we might have. So those will be purely scheduling, but we will have how to auto scale. It will be integrated with scheduling. So
yeah, I think sig-scheduling will be on the heart of the WAS all the time, but lots of other SIGs and other sub-project will go and will come and go, but lots of them. So it's a lot of communication. So it's but sig-scheduling will, I think it will be there.
But I really like how it looks like today.
Mhm.
So there is engagement from many people. This is not directly led by sig-scheduling leads, which offloads, as a lot. As a sig-scheduling leads, we can delegate, some of the responsibilities to specific people to become sub leads or we don't know how it will evolve.
Okay. Thank you, Matt.
Well, like the last thing I wanted to say is like I agree. Like eventually, again, I'm just worried like for the next cycle, right? Because I think we now have a great momentum, but we also by delaying or like going again to alpha in 136, like going to beta in 137 is now even more important, right? And we have a lot of things to discuss, a lot of things to do. We already know a lot of problems to tackle. I'm just worried whether like starting a working group now, which will slow us down initially, is a good idea, or maybe we should like delay and like do it after 137, after we go to beta. So like
We need
just
to
my
delay it, definitely.
Sorry?
Yeah, I think I agree. I guess I also like how we go fast, right? Like over the last couple of months, we discussed a lot of great topics, and we see many people actually feel really exciting about having this feature in Kubernetes. I think we've been dreaming to have this since 2020, 2019, right? And right now we finally have at least gang scheduling in core. I guess I know we're gonna have the booth, right, in the KubeCon, which will be together with KQ. Hopefully, many of folks maybe be there in person, maybe speaking with, with users, contributors, developers to understand how to give them more visibility, especially, I think the missing piece is workload owners, right? The folks who maybe managing their own internal CRDs, maybe they have their own internal, integrations, like how we can build a story closer with these folks maybe would be interesting for us to talk about. And I think the last point I want to make around KQ, because I think as Kevin said, like there are a lot of really overlaps, right? And I hope, the folks here can learn about use cases from Q project, right? Because I see a lot of momentum there as well in topology, right? And how people right now decide to use Q maybe for other type of workloads, right? And we definitely need to understand what needs to be changed in the core. So we work together in terms of bringing this first class support in Kubernetes. That is why I guess at least maybe joining the Q calls might be useful, right? For people who actually developing vast story in core and building this relationship with Q developers.
To be honest, I totally agree with you. I can see we need to start this conversation as soon as possible with Q. I'm a little bit afraid from the lots of similarity. People will start to use WAS, and they're already using Q. What will happen? What is the behavior? Do we plan for this? Do we have any end-to-end tests for that? What is the use case? It's a lot of questions actually in my head.
Yep.
And I think we need to start the conversation with Q as soon as possible. I agree. Matt?
Old hand again, sorry.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Yuki?
So as Q owner, so actually recently we started to periodically testing with Kubernetes main repository in Q repository. So we are trying to detect is there any conflict between core gang mechanism and the Q mechanism. So I guess So if Q side find any conflict with core, we can raise issue. But yeah, hopefully we should share any covered features between those components before we find problems. So the question is how to share, how to collaborate feature enhancements between those components in this meeting, or sig-scheduling, or apps, batch working group, or where should we go?
I think it should be here. Yeah, it should be in this meeting, which again, the core for what we are talking about, which is, like it should be like a meeting or a dedicated place for the WAS integration. But thank you so much for doing that, because, like I have lots of nightmares in my head for the integration with Q. Similar thing actually with LWS and JobSet, like all these small sub projects. So thank you so much for taking care of that. Kevin?
Yeah, I guess the only thing is from sig scheduling side, I think it sounds like we're gonna continue with sig scheduling. Can we add this as like a meeting that people could discover to link to? Because like right now I'm kind of just going to whatever Slack thread was in sig scheduling and trying to find this one. So it might be helpful too.
My suggestion to put it into sig scheduling agenda doc, but let it be led by Heba or Matt, Wojtek, whoever is.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. I just want to make sure like this is discoverable for the community and not like a handful of people that know about it. Because right now it does feel a little bit like it's in the know. It's not really a community. Like well, obviously there is a community, but I think if we put it somewhere for people to discover, that is, I think, good enough right now.
Yeah, this is my concern actually. It's like it's not discoverable. You have to tell someone that there is a meeting here, and we can do better, I believe.
Yeah, once we decide that working group is better or integrate with other existing, then of course we can make further changes.
Did we consider to actually have a dedicated GitHub project for us?
Why?
Like at least, we can see all the ongoing KEPs, right?
I think the dashboard would do it. Like GitHub project dashboards can, we can have everything related to us on one dashboard, so you can go through it, know what's going on, what is the enhancement will go in each release and stuff like that. Because having a repository, it's like the code, it's already, like we don't have like a dedicated code. I don't know, but it's
I was more asking about sig-scheduling. I know sig-scheduling has a dedicated GitHub project, right? I was asking, if sig-scheduling can have a substream, right? Or dedicated WAS related activities.
Actually, I try to make a new view for WAS and sig scheduling dashboard, but it was a little bit hard because there is no label, nothing, like to just filter, except like the title maybe. Sometimes people adding WAS in the title, sometimes no. So it was a little bit hard for me to find the criteria or like something to filter with.
Is the only way to get a label to do a working group, or can we just get a label from the?
I think we can. I don't know.
Yeah, same thing with Slacks. We can always get a Slack channel too added. Like, you don't need a working group to have a Slack channel added in the community. If people think that's useful, I can go ahead and open that one up. But also maybe we leave it for now. But yeah, we could have a Slack. Like all these things, I don't think they require that one, and I think there's just like you can add a label to Prowl to get one added. It's just
So I think what we, like the conclusion for our discussion, we eventually need the working group. We might need it, like with high percentage, but it's not necessary right now. We can keep working as is, but we can see it happen, like in the near future. Is that right? Okay. So I think I'm not sure. I will discuss. I believe with the scheduling app, auto scaling, to see like their opinion. If they see like it's good to have working group, we can create a working group. Otherwise, we can just like go ahead with creating a Slack channel, and that's it for now. Okay, I think we will share the like the discussion, or like what we ended up with next meeting, I believe. All right, perfect. Thank you all. Hopefully, we will get the KEPs ready today, and if there's any updates from them, please let us know as soon as possible. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.